back to Proverbs. We're going to look at the second part of the factual data sheet. We looked at macro hermeneutics, or the big picture of Proverbs, its genre, how the book is divided into different sections. Now we're going to look at the content of each passage. That is micro hermeneutics. We're going to move from the outside, remote, and distant context to the inside of the proverb itself. So, here's some advice from Jeffrey Arthur's in his book on genres and how to preach genres and how genres should impact your preaching and sermons. And I'm going to use some of his advice. Allow the form of the Proverbs to influence how you prepare and preach Proverbs. We've touched on that a little bit. But here's what he says. He says, preach observations, not promises. Well, that's true much of the time, but we're going to see some exceptions to that. Proverbs summarizes, in many cases, the normal patterns. But the book of Ecclesiastes and Job handle the exceptions. For example, the conservative strain operates within the framework of an orderly world. Obedience brings blessing and disobedience brings failure. That's Proverbs. So it's called being conservative. But Job and Ecclesiastes give the exceptions. They're designated as radical. Job was obedient and he suffered. That's different from the general message of Proverbs. Solomon in Ecclesiastes was disobedient and he prospered. So Arthur says, perhaps you could preach two series to honor that balance. The first could be, you reap what you sow. The second, what do you do when you plant a carrot and you get an onion? And so we need to realize the difference between Proverbs, Job, and Song of Solomon. Next he says, do not preach selfish behavior, humanism, materialism, such as the prosperity gospel from Proverbs 22:4, which says, by humility and the fear of the Lord are riches. Well, again, that's a general observation, but it is not always true. Preach units, preach thought units. We've mentioned this about Proverbs 10, where you have the topical approach beginning. And so you have themes like old age, gossip, laziness, alcohol, humility. So you would preach a thematic sermon. You would not go verse by verse as you can in the first 9 chapters. Use your imagination. To relate what was common in the day of Solomon to what would be common in our day. Show as well as tell. So when Proverbs talks about the abuse of alcohol, show it, tell it. My dad was an alcoholic. I grew up in an alcoholic home. And so I hope that's not your story. I hope that's not your testimony. But you can find testimonies like that. Turn on the spotlight. Let the roving spotlight swing across society to find situations illuminated by the proverb. So Proverbs 26:20 talks about gossip. So there's plenty of stories out there about gossip and the danger, what harm it brings sometimes. Make your central idea proverbial, as in 18:21, death and life are in the power of the tongue. So that sort of relates to the gossip. Use your tongues to provide life and not bring death. Dueling proverbs, such as Proverbs 26:4 and 5. Answer not a fool according to his foolishness. Answer a fool according to his foolishness. Well, that's not a contradiction. And Jesus actually illustrates that because he did not answer Herod, but he did answer the Herodians. So you have to know when to answer, when not to answer. Borrow the proverb movement. And so he talks about, in that case, where you have antithetical parallelism, synthetical, synonymous, and he gives us some instructions there in chapter 3, how that can help us in our preaching and teaching. Adopt the teacher's stance, because that's what Solomon is doing. He is teaching his son. So we could bring that element into our congregation sometimes, asking questions, asking for discussion, etc. Feature women, because Proverbs does. You could talk about the virtuous woman in Proverbs 31. Use humor, because the author of Proverbs does. He talks about the lazy man saying, I can't go to work because there's a lion in my front yard. Well, lions were not in the city in the days of Solomon. They were out in the wilderness and the jungle areas. Use homespun language, because Solomon does, and we should not, as Arthur says, we should not preach with a stained glass voice and sound like our favorite systematic theologian. Put the cookies on the bottom shelf, Spurgeon said. Allow the kind of proverb to influence how you preach. So he talks about descriptive, which is describing what is done, not prescribing what we should do. And that brings us to the general guidelines that do have exceptions. So these are descriptive, such as Proverbs 15:1. This is descriptive. A soft answer turns away wrath, but it doesn't always. But grievous words stir up anger. Jesus gave a soft answer, but he was crucified. So that's descriptive, but it is an observation that is generally true. It's better to give a soft answer than to retaliate. And then you have unconditional proverbs that are always true without exception. These are prescriptive. We don't hear this element of the Proverbs often explained. But this is a great point here that several of these authors right here note, like Greg Parsons. And most time when we read these unconditional proverbs, they're related to the character of God, which is unchanging. For example, Proverbs 11:1, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord. The Lord always disapproves cheating, stealing, ripping people off. That's an unconditional statement right there. If somebody is dishonest, that is going to displease the Lord. There's no exceptions to this. This is not descriptive. This is prescriptive. And McCabe calls these proverbs moral absolutes. So that's a good distinction to make. And you could do some sermons on the general observation of Proverbs, but then go back, such as in Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. This is where it sort of bothered me. I kept reading and learning about Proverbs. Well, they're general observations that are not always true. What about Proverbs 3, 5, and 6? Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not into your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path. Is that generally true? No. This is always true. If we trust in the Lord, he is going to direct us. It may not be exactly where we want to go, but this is not an observation. If you trust, sometimes he will direct you, sometimes he will not. So it's good to know there's a distinction between the general observations in Proverbs and those unconditional promises.